Okay, shall we make a start? It's not quite 6 o'clock, but we are radically punctual here at NTU, so we'll begin. Guests, colleagues, students, good afternoon. I'm Edward Peck, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Nottingham-Trent University, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to this special occasion, the inaugural lecture of Professor Phil Wood. A moment marked not only a milestone in his career, but also offers us the chance to learn from a truly reflective and deeply experienced educational thinker. Did you write this yourself? Oh. Must be true then. I want to extend a very warm welcome, particularly to his family, friends and collaborators. I don't know who his friends and collaborators are, but I do know who his family is. So we have June. Hang on. I guess you're Amy. Hang on. You're not first. This is the order in which he gave them to me, Amy. His mum, June, is the right order probably. Hello, June. His son, Archie. His partner, Amy. And his stepson, Cormac. Hello all, nice to see you. There's somebody else in the middle whose name I haven't... You're his... Right. Well, you're very welcome too. Right, there's a whole picture now. And Phil's journey has been blessed by the help and mentorship and friendship with many people who have played a major role in him being in this position today. And for nearly 5 decades, Phil has lived and breathed education as a student, as a pupil, as a student, a teacher, researcher, leader, and now as Professor of Education in our very own Nottingham Institute of Education at NTU. His career has taken him from the classroom to the lecture theatre, from national curriculum development projects to international research networks. But what underpins Phil's contribution is his fascination about how change emerges in a complex world and how it could happen better. He began his academic life as a geographer, completing his doctorate in a subject I can't pronounce at Royal Holloway. But its focus is exploring the development of geochronology in coastal environments in the Mediterranean. So you imagine overall that has quite a complicated title. He then trained as a teacher at the University of Leicester before teaching Lincolnshire schools in the 1990s and early 2000s. Phil experienced firsthand the emerging pressures and distortions introduced by neoliberal policy and new public management. Blimey, I haven't had those two terms for years, Phil, so I'm looking forward to hearing where they've got to these days. At the same time, he was involved in a national curriculum innovation project that showed a very different way forward, one that centred on creativity, criticality, and the possibility of meaningful change through collaboration and professional dialogue. These two experiences, the policy-driven constraints and the glimpses of something better, have become the twin threads of Phil's scholarly life. Through work in lesson study, pedagogic innovation, and conceptualising change through complexity theory and process philosophy, Phil has focused on both critiquing the systems that fail teachers and imagining the ones that might lift them up. His lecture night brings all that together, decades of insight, research, and reflection, as he explores a personal genealogy of education. From macro policy shifts to the micro experiences of teachers and students, Phil will guide us through the processes and impacts of change. And he'll also consider what kind of educational institutions we are creating and what kind we might dare to build instead. So whether you're an academic, a student, a teacher, or simply someone who believes in the power of education to transform lives, he hopes this lecture will raise questions and offer an opportunity for reconsideration. So it gives me a very great place to welcome Professor Phil Wood for tonight's lecture, From Ruskin to the Wasteland and Beyond, a personal genealogy of change in education. Phil.
Hello everyone, and thanks ever so much for making time to share in this occasion. I wanted to, when I started to think about this and understood that doing an inaugural really is about your journey, how you've developed over a period of time, it felt to me to be a useful jump-off point really to think about using almost a Foucauldian genealogy, which Niche very I think usefully defines as being a way of looking at change over time that questions mainstream truths. And when I talk about mainstream truths in this particular instance, I suppose in many ways I'm actually talking about the kind of political truths, the public truths about education, and to try and unearth something different, something hidden. In doing that, obviously, with the time I've got, this is very much an overview. I can't go into loads of detail about things, but it is to try and get a sense of the kind of change we've seen and the processes that are important in those changes, and why I personally think, particularly in the school sector and increasingly with the university sector, we are actually creating, in my opinion, an educational wasteland. The other thing I'd say is that this is about the sector. It's about the sector average. Unless I mention a particular organisation, I am not trying to give hidden indications about particular organisations. I know when people say this, it becomes an interesting parlour game to try and work out who you're talking about, but I am really just talking about the sector in general. As a background to this, when I started to think about what I was going to talk about, I realised that I started school in 1976. And much to my surprise, and certainly to my mum and dad's surprise, I think, I've never actually left ever since. At the age of 16, I wasn't going to do A-level. When I'd done my A-levels, I wasn't going to university, and somehow I've ended up staying in education all my life. And that's a photograph of me, I think about 6 months before I started primary school. My brother's 6 years older than I am, and like most really annoying small children, when he got a new football kit for the new academic year, I felt that it was up to me to try it on. And 1976, I think, is a really important marker, because that's actually the year that James Callaghan made the Ruskin College speech. And whilst that speech generally isn't about education, there is elements of education in it where he's beginning to critique the progressive education that had taken hold as a result of the rise of comprehensive schools in the late 60s. And he was arguing in many ways that actually this had been a wrong turn, that we needed to do something that was far more employment-based, etc., etc. And I feel in many ways what he actually ended up doing, unbeknownst to himself, is he opened the door ever so slightly that then subsequent secretaries of state, once the Conservatives had come in at the end of the 1970s, were able to kick open very quickly and begin to make really quite radical changes. And therefore it became apparent to me that actually my time in education has literally just tracked the whole of that neoliberal arc. That I started school in the year that he made that speech, and obviously for the next, ultimately, pretty much 50 years, I've continued to have experience of that system. I grew up in a house full of education. I had to include this photograph. That's me and my dad on the right. The reason my mum's not in this, I think she was taking the photograph, unfortunately. I love that photograph because it's the only image either in photograph from my own experience where my dad actually looks somewhat like Michel Foucault. He never has before or since, but that is something that I absolutely love about this photograph. But the thing about my dad was he became a head teacher at the age of, I think it was 36, in the early 1970s. He was the youngest head teacher in Lincolnshire. He was one of the youngest head teachers in the country. And what was amazing about him was that he had very little ego. He saw his job as being one of making sure that those kids in his school who had failed 11 plus and were seen therefore not to be particularly academic had every opportunity available to them. And he had an interest in the 1970s, a keen interest in the 1970s in special educational needs at a time when officially people were still being referred to as educationally subnormal. So he had an amazing capacity for seeing the positive in people and seeing the positive in education and helping support people rather than trying to be seen as being the big person himself. He would quite happily sit in the background and just help other people be the best that they could be. My maternal grandparents are also on that photograph. My nana actually was a theatre sister in heavy industry for a long time and apparently was extremely good at her job. My granddad was actually an articled marine engineer. but he only ever went to sea once. He actually went on a voyage to Djibouti and back, and he never went back to sea again because he realised that as an officer, whenever he went drinking with all of his mates who were the deckhands, he would get in trouble with the captain. So when he got back to this country, he told them that they could stuff their job. He then went into heavy industry, and he was a trade unionist, and he actually got the first shower block and the first dirty money payments for heavy industrial workers on Teesside. So I was really fortunate, in my opinion, that I grew up in a household that was full of communitarianism, that was full of doing the best by other people, and full of education. And also within all of that, I was given a real strong notion of an ethic of care from all of the people around me, but especially from my mum, who I have a huge memory of in the 1980s, constantly as a member of CND going off to marches in London and off to Greenham Common. I then left home at 18 to go to study geography at Liverpool University, and I'd love to tell you that I did that because it was an incredibly innovative degree, which it was. It was a degree that allowed me to engage with the notion of change for 3 years, and that's where I got my passion from. Unfortunately, it wasn't because of the degree, it's because Liverpool is equidistant from the Peak District, North Wales and the Lake District, and is absolutely fantastic for mountaineering as a result. Having spent 3 years there, I then went on to Royal Holloway, University of London, where I was in the Quaternary Sciences division and did research on identifying tsunami deposits in the Mediterranean, and then using something called optically stimulated luminescence dating. It's basically firing lasers at sand grains to work out how old the deposits were. I love my time doing my PhD, but I actually found working in that kind of department, it was the premier department in Europe at the time for quaternary science, and many of the people individually were brilliant. Actually, as a group, it became quite difficult because the level of ego I found really difficult to deal with. And in the end, I decided actually that I'd enjoyed the teaching I'd done during that time more, and decided to go into teaching instead. And started teaching in 1996, the year before Tony Blair came to power, and left teaching in the same year that he finished being Prime Minister. And I moved to HE, and it was totally down to a guy called Alan Sutton, who was the geography PGCE tutor at Leicester, and he mentored me. He taught me how to teach, kept in contact, and then mentored me back into his role within the university. And I will be forever thankful to Alan. He was absolutely amazing. And again, he was another person. He was an amazing academic. He was fluent in Mandarin Chinese. But actually, he never wanted to be in the limelight. He always wanted to help other people whilst doing his own research as well. And he was an amazing colleague for a number of years. So with that as a background, I just want to think about sort of what a genealogy means to me. I do most of my research now on the nature of change through the lens of processual complexity. And that quote there from Hanez in 2008, I think, is absolutely central to any thought about how you begin to unpick change over time. In that actually, there are multitudes of processes. In any context that we're in, there are multitudes of processes that are streaming forward, flowing forward over time. They tangle with one another, they tangle in, they tangle out. And as a consequence, we can't actually see the entirety of them. All we can hope to do is to try and tease out a few strands to follow over a period of time to get a flavour of the kind of things that have happened. And therefore, what I want to do in the remainder of the time today is to tease out 3 strands. First of all, I want to tease out the macro, what I see as being the neoliberal state and the impact of neoliberal policy on education. Then to think about the micro scale, which I have had a lot of experience in doing actual pedagogic research on bringing about change at a small scale, at a local scale. And then finally to look at how those two things butt up against each other. because I think they're actually very, very different worlds with very, very different assumptions as to how the world works. And that is at this mesoscale where you see the daily work of professionals butting up against the results of the policy trajectory that we've seen, which is why I think we have a serious problem in education at the moment, because those two things don't marry together at all well. And then to finish off with is to really give two simple models or frameworks that we're working on at the moment, which shows, that, first of all, as an archetype where we've got to with what I'm calling the disassociative organisation, and then where I think we need to go, which is what I would call the promotive organisation. So if we start with the impact of the neoliberal state to begin with, and what I've tried to do in each of these cases is, as a genealogy, is to give some quotes from papers that I've been involved in writing, and just take you through some of the ideas that I think this covers. And my work in this really started in work with Chris Wilkins, who's here this evening. We were both working on ITE at Leicester, and were responsible for rolling out the SED, the self-evaluation document, which was the ITE version of the school's self-evaluation form. And we wrote about that. And then I also did some work with somebody called Howard Stevenson, who's just retired from the University of, where we were looking at the impact of high-stakes assessment on the work of teachers. What I would argue is that when you start looking at education and the impact of policy, if you accept that Callaghan, if you like, sounded the starting gun for the neoliberal reform and discourse, what we've seen since then, from 1979 onwards, is just a succession of policies, each of which has built on the one before, but which ultimately have given us issues around quasi-privatisation, certainly the rise of performativity and accountability. To the extent now that particularly in schools, I would have said that we are in a hyper-accountability environment where actually the amount of surveillance, the amount of data that's being collected is having a serious detrimental effect to the health of the sector. And what's underpinning this is a misappropriated use of Taylorism. If you actually read Taylor's work, in many ways there's nothing wrong with it, because what Taylor is actually looking at is a manufacturing base. What he's trying to do is to create an efficient manufacturing environment where factories work in an efficient way that allow the workers to have a better overall climate to work in. Fine. But the problem is that a school or a university is not a factory. It's not dealing with making widgets. And as a consequence, if you try and apply Taylorism to education, I would argue, or any social process for that matter, it begins to come unstuck. And I think one of the most insidious impacts on education has been the rise of inspection. I don't know so much about the OFS. I must admit I've not been directly involved around aspects of the OFS, but certainly Ofsted, I would argue, over the last 20 or 30 years has become the most malign process in education and has distorted education to the point of breaking it. And I think it's really interesting that the new Ofsted toolkit has just been published for schools, and on at least 5 subsequent occasions I've spoken to people who are either head teachers themselves or who have spoken to head teachers, and their immediate reaction is, that's it, I'm done, I'm out, I'm going, because this is the final straw. So actually we've created quite a toxic environment, in my opinion. And what underpinned this, certainly in the early period, and I think still lives on certainly in schools in many ways, is the rise of new public managerialism. And the idea of bringing in a lot of these sort of notions of accountability, of measurement, etc., into the system, that has actually ended up making the work of teachers and of students in many ways increasingly difficult. I've also looked at what I think are some of the impacts of this. I wrote a paper over a decade ago now which used Gilles Deleuze's very short paper from the early 90s called The Postscript to the Society of Control. And in that paper, what he argues is that if you go back to, say, the 1950s or 60s and you look at some of the early work by people like Foucault, people are understood as part of a group. He thinks about prisons and people's dynamics in prisons or in clinics. By the time you get through to the work of Deleuze and Guattari in the 1980s, they are now shining a light on the individual. And their work is very much about using almost sort of a psychoanalytical frame to look at the relationship between the individual and capitalism. But what Deleuze does is he introduces this idea of the individual. And what he's essentially arguing is that we've got to a stage now where us as individuals, as corporeal bodies, are associated with a constant flow of data that is connected to us. And the way society has moved forward is that as far as corporations, politicians, organisations are concerned, they're more concerned and interested in the data than they are the human beings that are associated with that data. A mundane example would be supermarket loyalty cards. They're not interested in us as individuals. What they're interested in is big data that they can then use to make their own processes more efficient and to make them more profit. It's the data that's important to them, not us. Now, when you take that into, say, a school environment, you get into the stage now where data on behaviour, data on attendance, data on outcomes are becoming or have become far more important in many instances than the students themselves or the teachers who help produce that data. The other thing that I think has happened is that due to the rise of, for example, Ofsted, you've had a huge burgeoning within the accountability system of the need for senior leaders. So when I was at school in the 1980s, big secondary school, 1,300 of us, there was a head teacher and 2 deputy heads. And that was it. That's all you needed. And actually one of them just seemed to sort of bumble about the place looking important, didn't seem to do very much. So actually that could work in a school in the 1980s. But the reason for that was because you didn't have a huge string of external expectations, demands. You didn't have Ofsted breathing down your necks. You didn't need a cast of thousands to be tracking all of the various issues that were going on that you had to be accountable for. And as a consequence, what I would argue has happened is that we now have extended leadership teams. Everybody has to have a change project every year. You can't be without a change project because in your appraisal you have to demonstrate how you're taking the organisation forward. You can't say, well, actually this year what we're going to do is do what we did last year, embed it a little bit further, make it better. No, you've got to have a change project. And at the top level that might work quite nicely because each individual might only be responsible for 1 or 2 projects that they have overview of. But when that gets pumped down the pipe, people at the bottom of the organisation might be hit with 5, 6, 7 of these things that they are then juggling and trying to make work. And the problem that you then get is that you have this whole environment then of hyper-change, people trying to deal with vast amounts of change that is far too big for them to assimilate. You can't go through that amount of change and normalise it into your everyday practice. There's just too much of it. So the way that people react to that is that they deal with it in one of a number of ways. One is to ignore it. And I've always been surprised at the number of change projects that people just simply do not engage with. And nobody ever comes back to them and sort of said, you still haven't done this. On occasion they might, but quite often they won't. Presumably because they've got enough returns from somewhere else for them to be able to say that it's being done and it's all fine. Sometimes you get reaction where people will look at the stuff they've already got, cast around for information and data, repurpose it and send it back up. Sometimes people will just make it up. They won't actually do it, they'll literally just make it up. And I remember on one occasion when I was at Leicester University, we had peer observation systems suddenly arrive. We couldn't really see why we needed to do it. We didn't see what the utility was of doing it, so we just made it up. We just wrote a load of stuff, pretended we'd observed one another, sent it back, and we got an email 2 or 3 months later saying that the PVC in charge of teaching and learning thought it was absolutely wonderful, the standard of stuff that we were doing. On the odd occasion, what you will get is people thinking, actually, this makes sense. In our local environment, in our part of the organisation, this makes sense. And then they will attempt to go through with the change as expected. The problem being that in a lot of schools in particular, by the time you're just beginning to get to grips with it and develop it, that's dropped and you're on to the next thing. So, as I've argued in the past, what that leads to, in my opinion, is that schools and, I guess to some degree, universities are replete with what I've called zombie innovation. And what I mean by zombie innovation is that these are change projects where the people at the top think it's all working swimmingly well and are writing evaluation reports and it's been really successful. The people at the bottom are just breathing a breath of relief that they've got through another year and haven't been caught out. And the innovation itself is staggering around in the twilight, neither alive nor dead, and just accrues over a period of time. And I would argue that the reason that there is so much of this beginning to happen, problems with individuation, problems with hyper-accountability, problems with zombie innovation, is that there is a fundamental philosophical category error that is driving the system. And that is that the system is complicated and linear in nature. And as a result, the analogy that's being used is that it's being treated like an engineering issue. That we understand what's going on, we just have to pull the right levers, and if we do that, everything will be fine and everything will move on. And I would argue, as I'll show you in a little while, that I really think this is a massive category error, and this is why the system is on the precipice of collapse, certainly in schools. At the same time as doing macro work, I've done micro work, and that started in many ways with a second PhD that I did at Birmingham University, where I actually did research on working with GCSE students to develop an approach to personalised learning within the GCSE classes that we were involved in. And from there, I've always tried to retain an element of pedagogic research, because I find that sort of small-scale change process absolutely fascinating and incredibly enjoyable. I think probably some of the most important work in this area I've done with somebody called Vasil Cycler, who sadly couldn't be here this evening. He was a modern foreign languages PGCE tutor. He was involved in masters. He did all kinds of things while we were at Leicester, ending up after I'd left with actually running the department for a couple of years. And starting in about 2013, the pair of us started doing some research in something called lesson study. Lesson study is a highly stylized version of action research. And what you do with lesson study is you identify learning challenges that the students have, not interests that you have in terms of teaching. You start from the learning end. And having identified challenges that they're facing, you then create a detailed plan for a lesson to try and overcome that challenge, to try and help them in their learning. It comes from Japan. Japan has been using it for something like 100 to 120 years and is seen as being a massive national asset for professional development. Funnily enough, not only in teaching, but they use it in the medical sphere and other sectors as well. Anywhere where actually there are issues that you can try and dissect and understand better. But for me, the really important thing with lesson study is that it's engaging with the complexity. It's working with the complexity. And we did a fascinating study. It was funded by a body, gave us about £10,000. And what we actually did was we took the geography PGCE students from my group, the modern foreign languages students from Vassal's group, and when they went into their school practice, they actually carried out lesson study alongside their mentors and other members of staff within their departments to explore this idea of learning challenges. And what we realised is that what we were seeing was a really rapid acceleration in their ability as teachers. Because actually, the traditional model of ITE is put somebody in the department, have an observation once a week, have a tutorial once a week, and the student is left in many ways to try and work out what the next step might be in their practice and then try and mimic that the next week. And if it goes really well, great, you carry on. If it doesn't, then you try something else. What this was doing was creating really detailed dialogue. It was allowing somebody who was just coming into the profession to get into, if you like, the mind, what we call the pedagogic black box, the mind of experts, how their thinking processes operate, how they develop something and why they develop it in that way, and then being able to see how that works and evaluate it before playing around with it to make it even better, and then the student teacher would reteach the lesson to a different group, having seen what really good learning looks like. And what we found was this acceleration, and there was plenty of evidence to suggest that this was down to the dialogue, the exploration, and having the space and the time for professional growth that had meaning in a local context. Interestingly, we are pretty sure you couldn't do that now, because there are so many boxes to tick, there are so many ways in which IT has become micromanaged that you just would not be able to find the time and the resource to do that kind of activity within a school placement. Instead, it's better to go and collect a load of data to prove that you're doing a good job. What we then moved into from this was to say, well, okay, then what's the result of this? How do we take this forward? And we came up with this idea of what we called pedagogic literacy. And the argument that we made was that the problem with ITE, at the time we were doing this 10 years ago, is that if you became a student teacher and you were going to qualify, you had to basically satisfy a tick list of about 24 competencies. Oh yeah, we've done that one, that's done, yeah, that one's done, yeah, we work on these two and then you'll be a good teacher. And what we argued is that that is an incredibly reductive process in itself, but it also creates a really reductive view of what being a teacher is. And that actually being a teacher is an incredibly complex process that involves a huge number of different processes. And when we created pedagogic literacy, the first thing that we said is, because it's complex, this is an aide-memoir. This is not a complete model. You can't create a complete model of the work of being a teacher. It's too complex, there's too much of it. And if you accept that it's a complex adaptive system, as many complex adaptive system theorists will tell you, the only model that is a complete model is that one as big as the reality itself, and therefore you'll never get there. So this was a model framework, really, I suppose, that we had created, and the way we saw it was this would be really useful for people to be able to use to sit around and talk about. Where are we? What's next? What do we need to develop in our own practice? And that therefore what pedagogic literacy should allow is the idea that you can continue to grow and develop and emerge over a whole career. Not that you reach some kind of designated point 4 or 5 years in and then jobs are good. And therefore, it's about, again, emergent processes and seeing teaching as being very much a process of exploration and long-term development. I've also done some work within HE. So myself and somebody called Matt O'Leary, who's a professor at Birmingham City, who again unfortunately couldn't make it this evening, he asked me at one point to write a chapter for a book that he was helping to edit on the Teaching Excellence Framework. And I sort of said, well, you know, look, I'm quite happy to do that, but you do understand that I think the Teaching Excellence Framework really is pretty dire. And his immediate reaction was, yeah, that's what I thought, that's why I'd like you to write it. And what I argued in that is that actually part of the problem with teaching excellence, if you go back to the work of people like Caroline Kreber in the late 90s, teaching excellence meant something. It had some heft behind it, it had some meat. But as you move forward over time, what it's become, again, is almost a series of tick lists. It's very reductive. In some cases, the kind of data that relates to the Teaching Excellence Framework isn't really about teaching and learning. It's about other stuff. To my mind, it's a bit of a mess. And it's also, again, incredibly reductive. It's a case of distorting something so that you can get quantitative data out of it. And what we at that time suggested is that instead, off the back of, I suppose, the work that we've done on pedagogic literacy, we started making the case that actually what we should be talking about instead of teaching excellence is emergent pedagogies. Take away all the baubles, take all away the bells and whistles. Let's actually start engaging with the complexity of teaching and learning. Let's actually start engaging with trying to see this as a long-term exploration and development of deep practice. The problem for me with this is that I started to have real problems with using the word pedagogy because it means leading children. And as somebody working in HE, I felt that was really not hitting the spot. So I did quite a lot of thought about this, and I used the work of somebody called Nigel Tubbs, who's written a really fantastic book called The Philosophy of the Teacher. And in that, he uses this idea of, you know, how do we describe the teacher? So it could be describing a teacher as master or teacher as servant. And when I started to give this a lot of thought, I actually thought, well, actually, no, what we're actually talking about here, and what I'm trying to do with students, when I was in schools, but certainly at degree level and above, is actually when I look at my own disciplinary understanding in geography and or education, it's a landscape, it's a disciplinary landscape. There are a whole series of things that fit together in networks. And actually what I should be doing is trying to give people a good understanding of what that landscape looks like, what the elements in that landscape are, and then on top of that, my job then is to help them learn how to navigate that landscape themselves. So there's an element in there about understanding content and how it relates to each other, and I think modularisation has been a problem as far as that's concerned. I remember at A-level trying to get students to think about geography holistically rather than just thinking about the particular modules that they'd covered. But in doing that, I then need to try to help them gain the skills and the confidence to begin to navigate that disciplinary landscape themselves. And hopefully, at some point, get to a stage where they are going and exploring parts of that disciplinary landscape through those skills they've been given that I've never been to. Because to me, that's where it gets really exciting when I'm doing things like doctoral supervision, master's work, where people are actually coming and they're talking to you about stuff that you yourself hadn't had a look at. And actually, if you like, expanding your own landscape. I thought, well, okay, then fine. So what do we actually call this? Well, it's about complexity and it's about navigation. And complex navigation in ancient Greek, and I did get this verified by my dad, who was a linguist, you can use the term holoploidy. So I started sort of thinking, actually, we shouldn't be talking about pedagogy, we should be talking about holoploidy. That it's actually about the complex navigation of disciplinary fields. and enticing in and helping students understand and really enjoy working with that complexity. And I think what I take from this work on the micro scale is that actually teaching is a complex adaptive system. It's not linear, it's non-linear. It's not linear, it's non-linear. And it's ecosystemic. It's not an engineering analogy. And I think that's where the real dissonance occurs in education, because a lot of the policymakers, a lot of the policy in education, a lot of the way that that flows down through people like Ofsted is as if they are trying to solve a complicated engineering problem when actually they're dealing with a complex ecosystemic issue. And to me, that is a fundamental category error that causes serious problems. More recently, I've then started doing work at the mesoscale with Amy Quickfall, and we've worked together on various projects over the last few years, but the two I want to sort of very quickly go through here is where the macro and the micro butt up against one another, where the micro and the macro so obviously begin to impact on one another. And one area that we've looked at that is in relation to initial teacher education. We're into year 4 of a 5-year longitudinal study. It started off with Amy one day sort of, as we were coming out of the pandemic, saying, you know, this is awful. People are having a really bad time. The system seems to be under heavy pressure. This is terrible. So we decided that we would create a questionnaire, get ethics, and send it out and see what we got. And actually what we got was so interesting that we've now carried on as a longitudinal study, and we've included interviews as well. And I would argue that what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is an attempt to eviscerate ITE, initial teacher education, particularly by Nick Gibb and his the people around him, that he essentially started a market review that made no sense, that it led to a reaccreditation process that actually knocked various HE providers out of the system, and then suddenly realised that that was a majorly bad mistake because there wasn't enough capacity in the system. And funnily enough, at least one place that was told that they could no longer offer ITE because they weren't good enough, then went on to get a good grade by Ofsted. So the whole thing was a complete mess. But what it's done is, it's taken a system in ITE that was already under pressure, and it's added even more. Because what you have is a group of individuals. You have teacher educators who, when you talk to them, when you interview them, when you get stuff back through interviews, these are people with an innate ethic of care. These are people who get up in the morning wanting to make sure that they are helping individuals become exceptional teachers and to create a far better profession. But the problem is that the degree of micromanagement from above has now started to distort and get in the way of them being able to do that. And therefore, we're in a position where the positive and really crucial aspects of teacher educators' work is being pushed out by excessive workload and particularly external pressures from people like Ofsted. And the way that we've seen that working through in the data that we've got is that ITE workloads now are so high that that's actually beginning to curtail lecturers' ability to take part in other academic processes and activities within universities, because their job just takes up huge amounts of time. And ultimately, perhaps as no surprise, that then begins to have an impact on mental health, and it begins to have an impact on job sustainability. Schools haven't fared any better. Some research that we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years with head teachers shows that now, due to austerity and due to the pandemic, social services, particularly in deprived areas, are incredibly fragmented. And what is happening, it seems to us from the data that we've got, is that head teachers are now often the leaders in their local communities, and they are having to deal with a form of what we've called social triage. Families now are going to, particularly primary schools, with debt problems, health problems, social problems, and head teachers are either having to deal with those, even though they're not trained or have the resource, or trying to move them on to get support elsewhere. Interestingly, none of that extra work is part of the new Ofsted framework. So you as a head teacher could miss your targets by a couple of percent, and in that sort of weird Nando's colour chart that they've got in the new toolkit, could be down towards the red end because you're not doing your job properly, but actually you are the sole point that is keeping that community together. And nobody is giving you any thanks for that. And as a consequence, teaching has become a completely unsustainable activity. 25% of people who leave the profession each year are women in their 30s, because they are not able to see a way of being a teacher and having a family at the same time. And my own daughter at the age of 27 is one of those people. She actually got a job 2 weeks ago. She's been in the classroom for 4 years. She is moving now. She's staying in education, but she'll be working for Senna. She'll be a caseworker for taking SEND applications through. And the reason she's doing it, because she cannot see a way in which she can sustainably carry on doing that job and be a good parent. And that to me is just absolutely unreal. And what that means is that we now have a retention crisis where the job is seen by many as being utterly toxic, and in a large scale, I think there were 17,000 replies to a questionnaire that the NASUWT sent out in 2023 that showed that over 80% of respondents were self-identifying as having mental health issues. That is just unbelievable, and it shows to me this tension between people with an acute sense of ethic of care who want to do a good job and are actually being stopped by a hyper accountability system that is stopping them from doing what is important. No doubt about that in my mind, to be honest. And therefore, I think what we've done, the reason I called it a wasteland, Ruskin to Wasteland, is that my view, and I'm not saying it was perfect, it's always very easy to sort of look back at the mid-70s and sort of say, oh, wasn't it wonderful? You only have to watch Kes to realise that that's probably not true. But at the time of the Ruskin College speech, there was a real sense of professional autonomy. There was a real sense of professional trust. That's all gone. There's a brilliant book from 2011 by Jane Green. I can never remember the main title, but the subtitle, which I will always remember, is Hitting the Target but Missing the Point. And her argument is that actually accountability and trust are inversely proportionate. The more accountability you have, the more you drive trust out of the system. And at that time it was about local organic change. And at that time, it was very much community-driven. In the 80s, I went to a community college. There were adults having basket weaving lessons downstairs. You know, I mean, that was seen as being an absolute safeguarding nightmare now. But why we've got to now, where we are, is the impact of new public managerialism, hyper-accountability systems, a reductionist view of the world, which is just a category error, because we're dealing with complex adaptive systems, and something that is market-driven. So just to finish off with, where have we got to? Well, this is an attempt by us to begin to build what we think is just a sort of an archetypal rule of thumb, a heuristic of what we're calling the dissociative organisation. What we're arguing is that in modern educational organisations, you have two sub-organisations, the systemic organisation and the organisational life world, ideas taken from Habermas. And that at the top it's based around structures, performativity, quantitative understanding of the world, and lots of planned change projects, lots of strategic plans. That then has hyper-accountability, hyper-change, and official narratives bearing down. The reason the left-hand side of the arrows are dashed is that the narratives and the accountability moving up is far less prominent. And at the bottom, you have an organisational life world where people are working in fluid contexts, processual contexts, and they are dealing largely with a qualitative existence that is about human experience. And as a consequence, at that level, it is about emergent change. It's about the constant small changes that people are making to make practice better, to work with students well, etc. But the level of micro-accountability from the systemic organ has got to such a level that there is no space or time for that. You're either doing the teaching or you're reacting to what you're being given from people at the top. And once you don't have that space for emergent change, that is the engine room for keeping your organisation healthy. And once that disappears, your organisation is going to begin to misfire and to splutter. And the poor people sitting in the middle, in my opinion, are the middle leaders. Because these are the people who are trying to hold those two very different worldviews together. They're the people who are trying to translate the quantitative, linear engineering view of the world and trying to hold it together with the very much the ecosystemic, the complex world that the people at the bottom of the organisation are operating in. And I would argue, particularly in schools now, this has been stretched to such to the nth degree that the system really is, I think, entering into a state of collapse unless we do something quite serious about it. It's not helped either by the complete lack of funding, both in schools and universities. So what do we do about it? Well, I hate his politics, and I'm not too keen on his economics, but I've got to agree with Milton Friedman when he talks about the idea that during a crisis, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And I think one of the problems with academia, with educational academia, is that we are very good at critiquing. It's our safe zone. We can critique and say how awful things are and why they're awful. And we seem to think that if we just keep saying it, more people will agree with us. If people don't agree already that there's an absolute bin fire in schools, they're not going to agree if we write another paper saying what Foucault said. And therefore, I would challenge all of us to start thinking about how we create serious alternative models. And just to finish off with, this is the model that we're beginning to work on, a heterodox model of promotive organisations. And what we started to do with this, it's early days, but what we started to do with this is to make the argument that to decide what kind of education we want, we actually genuinely have a discussion and a reassessment as to what we want from education in an era of polycrisis. We are in an era of polycrisis, whether we like it or not. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, rampant authoritarianism, etc. What is the education we need to meet that challenge? And having Michael Gove stand up and tell us it's about reading all the best that has been written and said, in my view, doesn't really cut it. And I would argue that in whatever we create, we have to underpin it with process philosophy and particularly with complexity. Complexity theory is an absolute must because it's actually a way of being able to understand the systems that we're working with rather than pretending that they're complicated or simple. They're not, they're complex, and on occasion they're heading towards chaotic. And that means that we have to change the way we use data. I am a fan of data. I love a bit of quantitative data. I love lots of quantitative data. I love lots of qualitative data. But we've got to collect the right data, and we have to understand it in the right way, analyse it in the right way, and draw the right conclusions. At the moment, I would argue that all too often we're collecting the wrong data, we're analysing it badly, and therefore we are going down blind alleys all the time. I would also argue that we need to start taking ideas from all kinds of places. So, as an example here, I've given the idea of feminist economics. Feminist economics fundamentally creates a different view of value, and it isn't all based on money. It includes value in terms of care. It includes value in terms of happiness. And if economics is about the best distribution of resources, I think that feminist economics really is a no-brainer, because the way that we should be thinking about how we align economics has to include those things as well as being monetarily valuable. And as a consequence, where we've got to is we think we have to really think deeply about how we realign education to create environments for community and belonging. And I've got to say, Aaron's not here, but I've got to say that I think that early years are already doing this in spade loads. Really high quality early years education, I think, is an absolutely phenomenal model to base what we are doing on, because it's about care, it's about human development. It's already there, they're doing phenomenal things, but because of the English prejudice about early years being about wiping noses and bums, they're never really taken particularly seriously. And yet, the phenomenal work that really knowledgeable, brilliant practitioners in early years develop really ought to be, in my view, a practical basis from which we can expand. And the model that we've created is this model where we argue that it should be about belonging, everybody having a sense of belonging, fulfillment and thriving, and as a consequence, sustaining and sustainability. But we have to do it wholesale. We have to do it and mean it. What we can't do is what we've done in the past, where you get basically what I would see as being neoliberal window dressing. We're going to do well-being. Great. Hire the puppies. We'll let people stroke them for the afternoon. That's their well-being done. Or what I've heard in schools on a regular basis, we'll give them half a day off. You can have an extra half day at the end of term for your well-being. Not thinking that they're going to go home and try and catch up on the marking that they haven't done, or the data entry that they haven't done. So we have to mean it. But I would leave you with this idea that we need serious change. We need serious change that is well evidenced and well thought through, because when the system continues to get worse, as it's doing rapidly, we need an identifiable, tangible alternative that can lead us to a very different place. The very last thing I want to say is a huge thank you. This isn't everybody, but I had to think about this while I was preparing. These are all the people during my time in education that have led me to be here. These are all the people who have had influence. These are all the people that I've discussed ideas with. These are all people that have taught me invaluable things to help me develop myself as both a teacher and academic. And therefore, as I stand here, I couldn't be standing here if it wasn't for all of these people and more. Because actually, any of us who do really well, it is part of an extensive community of support. And going back to that processual philosophical idea, it's all of the experiences and events that flow and meld together to get you to any point in time where you have actually got to the stage where you are. So a huge thank you to all of those people, and obviously thank you for coming along and listening to what I have to say. Thank you.
Colleagues, friends, guests, my name is Darragh McDermott. I'm the Executive Dean of the School of Social Sciences, and it falls to me this evening to offer a vote of thanks to Professor Phil Wood for your inaugural lecture. I know that trying to showcase a career's worth of ideas, worth of experience, worth of research, and trying to present it in such a way that it's digestible to a very diverse audience, one that has a very broad age span, in this particular case, can be a real challenge.
He hears about this all the time. He's well known.
But I think what you've done this evening is you've provoked many questions for many of us. in the room, those of us who are in education and those of us who might be a little bit more on the periphery of it, and those of us who kind of live and living through the changes that may be going on across the sector. Some really insightful, some different perspectives, so thank you for that. It also falls to me to reiterate the thanks that are up on the board. So thanks to the very many colleagues with whom you have worked, with whom you discussed many of these ideas, both past and present, your family, your partner Amy, your son Archie, your stepson Cormac, and your mother June, who we are really delighted to have here with us this evening. And many of the friends and colleagues who were not able to make it this evening, but hopefully will be able to sit back and watch it in their own time. But also his thanks to his students, the very many students both here at NTU and previous higher education, but then also in secondary, who have been a key motivator for you across your career. I'd now like to invite you all to join us for refreshments and an opportunity to, I'm sure, ask Phil many intriguing and deep questions on the content that he has presented and to celebrate Phil's inaugural lecture. But before that, would you please all join me one final time for Professor Phil Wood. Don't forget your clicker. It's usually the thing that people end up.
It's not my clicker. I'm okay. I'll just leave that there. Congratulations, Phil.
Thank you.
Great talk, very interesting. Got some questions for you at some point. Yeah, more than happy to discuss them.